Welcome everyone to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and Green Finance 101 webinar. My name is Taylor Ward, she, her, and I am the Senior Manager of Communications and Education with Just Solutions. I am calling in from Seminole and Muskogee Land, also known as Tampa, Florida. For those who don't know, Just Solutions identifies and promotes just solutions to climate change from Black, Latino, Asian, Indigenous, and frontline diasporas. We are broadening and deepening the understanding of equitable and effective policies and projects, and are fostering a national community of peer learning for frontline community-based organizations to elevate their solutions and replicate them across the country. If you are on the call today, please feel free to add your name, your organization, and where you're located in the chat, and you can check out native-land.ca to find out whose land you are on. The purpose of today's webinar is to hear from experts on green financing, what we know about the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and discuss how organizations and nonprofits can participate and prepare for the $27 billion in funds, including at least $18 billion for environmental justice communities. Today's webinar will include an introduction of today's events, as well as an overview of green financing. Then we'll have an overview of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. We will then discuss the current status and discuss a call to action, answering the question of what do we do now? We will end off this webinar with a question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box and we will answer them during that period. Now to introduce our speakers. Today you will hear from Sylvia Shi, the Senior Policy Analyst at Just Solutions. Sylvia works on federal policies and financing and furthers policy innovation, fosters peer learning, and helps to build greater policy capacity for BIPOC frontline groups. We will also hear from Adam Kent, Director of Inclusive Finance, Green Finance, and Economic Development at NRDC. Adam works at the intersection of finance and climate with a particular focus on the role of housing, energy, and community development finance play in creating a more equitable and environmentally sustainable economy. And we will hear from Jamal Lewis, Director of Implementation, Learning, and Integration at Rewiring America. Jamal works to accelerate and scale up building electrification, particularly in disadvantaged communities. And I will now turn it over to Sylvia to share a bit more about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund Equity and Governance Best Practice Alliance.
Hey everyone, Sylvia Chi, Just Solutions Collective. I just wanted to introduce the Alliance, the GGRF Equity and Governance Best Practices Alliance. We are a group of organizations with deep experience in environmental, economic, and racial justice, and we came together after the Inflation Reduction Act passed to draw on our policy and on-the-ground experience and expertise working in green finance, environmental justice, and equity-focused programs to make sure that the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is implemented in a way that centers environmental justice communities. You can learn more about us through our website, and we'll drop the link for that in the chat. Next slide. During the application phase of the GGRF, our priority was engaging with and supporting applicants to incorporate strong equity and governance elements in their applications to EPA through this best practices pledge, which you can read more about on our website. And in the coming months, we'll be exploring how we can continue to support developing the pipeline of projects and facilitating connections between community-based organizations and community lenders and others in the GGRF ecosystem. But with that, I will hand it over to Adam to get us started.
Thanks, Sylvia, and hello, everybody. My name's Adam Kent. I use he, him pronouns, and I work at NRDC, which is an environmental nonprofit organization, and we've been doing a lot of work on the green finance. And so we wanted to open up the webinar just with a quick overview of green financing 101. It's very high level, but just to kind of give folks a flavor of what we'll be diving into today with more details on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So in general, you can kind of think of green financing as combining public and private dollars to accelerate the transition to a clean energy, towards clean energy, to combat climate change, and to create more resilient communities. And really, there are kind of different forms or shapes that these dollars can take. And so, for instance, you can have green financing programs that really rely on grants, which, so when you think about grants, they don't have to be repaid. It's typically free money that would go into a project or support an organization that may have certain mission-based requirements, but ultimately do not rely on an income stream that's generated to repay. The next kind of form you can think of like as loans or debt. This is capital that has to be repaid, but it can take different flexible structures depending on kind of where that loan comes in on a project. And then finally, you can think about kind of equity. So that's an ownership stake in a project. And typically there's some sort of ongoing dividend payment. So some portion of the project's income has to go to pay the equity investor. And then when the equity investor leaves the project, they're fully repaid based on their ownership stake. So those are different types of the way dollars can be structured into a green project. And so just, I know that's pretty general and vague, but let's just think about, for instance, like buying a house. Typically there's an equity investment from that home buyer, which you can think of as the down payment. Then the home buyer typically gets a loan or a mortgage from a bank. That's the debt portion of the capital. And that a home buyer may be a first-time home buyer. And in many states and localities, there's a first-time home buyer program where maybe you get a grant from your city or your state to buy that home. That's where that grant comes in as well. So it's very kind of a similar project financing structure. It's just with an orientation around delivering a more clean energy economy, more resilient communities. And just in terms of, we listed a couple of project like examples here in terms of this could go to renewable energy projects like solar or wind or battery storage. But it could also be used to what we call decarbonize housing or electrify housing, make it more energy efficient. But there's also applications for electric vehicles, small businesses that operate in this space, water and sanitation as well. In general, though, this kind of idea about green financing is really focused on using kind of limited public dollars to prove and create new markets. So for instance, a lot of market rate capital and lenders really are very risk averse, and they want to see proof of previous projects that have demonstrated success. So a lot of the ideas around green financing is you can prove a market and then crowd in additional capital. And then another really important concept is these dollars can potentially go to projects that otherwise would not be able to take on a full market rate loan. So for instance, the project may need $1 million of loan capital, but it's only going to generate a certain amount of income where they could only maybe take on $500,000 of loan capital. And so you can strategically use kind of the public dollars to really move projects forward that otherwise would not come to fruition. So if we can go to the next slide, we're going to be talking today in depth about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund program and spending the majority of our time on it. These dollars are going to get deployed through the majority of these dollars will be deployed through nonprofit lenders. And there's a couple of different flavors of nonprofit lenders out there that will be the majority of the capital will flow through these institutions. So the first are green banks. So these are mission-driven, non-depository institutions that really are focused on financing green projects. And so there are a number of green banks across the country. You can kind of see some more information here in the with the emphasis on time, we're just we're going to breeze through this because we want to get to the greenhouse gas reduction fund conversation. Another entity, if we can go to the next slide, that will be a key delivery mechanism where these dollars will flow through are community development financial institutions. So these institutions have been around for a long time. They were formed to really address redlining and discrimination in lending markets. And so CDFIs will be a key lender in the greenhouse gas reduction fund ecosystem. And then finally, on the next slide, credit unions, which are member-owned, not-for-profit financial institutions, are also eligible to kind of deploy this greenhouse gas reduction fund capital. So with that, I'll stop and I'll hand it over to Sylvia and Jamal to kind of take us more in depth on the GGRF.
Thanks, Adam. That was a really helpful overview of green financing. Again, I'm Jamal Lewis. I'm with Rewiring America. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to electrifying our economy, recognizing that electrification is essential to us meeting our climate goals and represents the best possible and most efficient and effective machines in the market. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Rewiring America has been very involved in pushing both the development and implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, in which the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund was created. So next slide. What is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund? It is the largest non-tax program in the Inflation Reduction Act. If folks probably at this point know that the vast majority of the incentives in the IRA come in the form of tax incentives that are largely unlimited, through 2031. And there's a set of programs that the IRA created, non-tax programs that the IRA created, also to proliferate clean energy and deploy clean energy throughout our economy. So the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is the single largest non-tax program. It is a $27 billion green financing program. So leveraging the basic understanding that Adam just provided, it is a program designed to deploy those types of products, resulting in, again, the additional deployment of low and zero emissions technologies. This is a critical tool, not just because it's the largest non-tax investment, but also because of its mandate to serve low-income and disadvantaged communities. Almost 70% of the funds are specifically by statute designated to go to low-income and disadvantaged communities. And the intent behind this program is, like Adam said, is to be a source of public dollars that can help, again, drive down the cost of capital and help to deploy clean energy technologies across our economy. Again, as Adam mentioned, green banks, CDFIs, credit unions, and other community-based lenders are absolutely critical to the deployment of these dollars. And then we'll go into this a little bit also, but the EPA basically designated 3 priority project categories. So distributed energy and storage. You can think about that as renewable energy sources like solar and wind. The second is net zero emissions buildings. So any project that is intended to reduce emissions and or achieve a net zero emissions building. So electrification is part of that. Rooftop solar is part of that. Energy efficiency is part of that. And then zero emissions transportation. So what does it look like to help deploy electric vehicles or electric fleets, things like that. Next slide. So the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund has three main objectives: reducing emissions and other greenhouse gas pollutants, per the name, to deliver benefits, particularly in low-income and disadvantaged communities. And number three is to be a source of capital that helps to bring other private capital to this industry as well. So how can the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, with this $27 billion, be leveraged to bring in other private and public capital? And we're kind of already seeing that too, with the creation of more like green banks or CDFIs looking to leverage other private capital. So we're kind of already seeing that now. Next slide. So the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund has three distinct but complementary programs. So we're going to talk about what those programs are, the types of funding that can come from those, as well as how much of that is set aside for low-income and disadvantaged communities. So the first is the National Clean Investment Fund, NCIF. The second is the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, CCIA. And the last is the Solar for All, SFA. So the National Clean Investment Fund and the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator both are intended to provide financing. These are so we're not talking about grants with these two programs. We're really talking about financing. And the National Clean Investment Fund is intended for at least 40% to be deployed in low-income and disadvantaged communities. CCIA is also a financing program, but 100% of that is intended for low-income and disadvantaged communities. And then Solar for All is also intended for 100% to go to low-income and disadvantaged communities. Solar for All, though, is a mix of grants and financing. And again, it's meant to deploy solar and storage. And sorry, it flows Solar for All flows primarily through states. I think there's a visual later on that'll talk about this. Whereas the NCIF and CCIA are intended to flow through nonprofit financing entities. Next slide. So there's a lot on this slide, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but we'll send these slides out afterwards. So for NCIF, that is the largest portion of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. It's a $14 billion pot that is meant to go directly from the EPA to 2 to 3 national nonprofits that will provide financial assistance, pre-development, market building activities, et cetera. And really, it's meant to support and directly finance qualified projects, which we'll talk about also. Clean Community CCIA, so the next row is the $6 billion pot of that $27 billion, and that is meant to so that is going to directly support 2 to 7 hub nonprofits that will then in turn award funding to networks of community lenders. The intent behind CCIA is to really boost up the capacity of community lenders to be able to support the types of greenhouse gas reduction projects that are desired and present in community. And then Solar for All is a $7 billion pot to be awarded to states, municipalities, tribal governments, and eligible nonprofit lenders. We expect that the majority will go to states. And this is meant for, again, some grants, mostly grants, but some financing to deploy solar, rooftop and community solar, and then enabling upgrades also. Next slide. So here's an example of what this might look like. 27 billion split up into the 3 programs. On the left, you've got the NCIF program. In the middle, you've got CCIA, and on the right, you've got Solar for All. Ultimately, those different pots are meant to support projects like community-owned solar, fleet electrification, multifamily building decarbonization, and then single-family rooftop solar also. So those are just examples of projects that are meant to be supported through this program. Next slide. And so I'm going to kick it over to Sylvia, who's going to talk about the rest of the GGRF program.
Yes, so Jamal mentioned that there are these 3 priority project categories, and these apply to the NCIF and CCIA programs. So again, those are distributed energy generation and storage, net zero buildings, and zero emissions transportation. And there's some more detail as to like how those categories are defined on this slide. Won't go into the details now, but again, we will be sharing the slides, so you can use this as a reference. Next slide. So now we'll go into each of those 3 programs in a little more detail. So again, NCIF is the biggest portion of the GGRF with $14 billion total. And it's the idea behind it is to create long-term financing for community lenders to deploy capital for clean technologies. It will go through 2 to 3 intermediary entities, and we'll describe them a little more a little later in the presentation. Those entities will in turn, they'll flow down eventually to individuals and families, nonprofit organizations, businesses, community lenders, and local government, state government, and others who are deploying qualified projects. Of the $14 billion, 40% have to be provided through financial assistance to low income and disadvantaged communities so that they can deploy or benefit from qualified projects. And the allowable costs for this program include financial assistance, which basically means mostly like loans and other kinds of financing, as well as pre-development activities, market building activities, and program administration. Those types of costs will be provided as grants. In terms of the timeline, the entities that applied to EPA to be those intermediaries, they had to apply by October 12th. So EPA has been looking over those applications and been talking with the applicants since then, and they have said that they will plan to notify the winners in March, so coming up really soon, and then they will make the awards in July. Next slide. So this is another way to look at how NCIF will work. Again, it'll go from the EPA to 2 to 3 of those intermediaries. The intermediaries will then flow the money down through community lenders, members of their own coalition, which will also be like community lenders or networks of community lenders and other entities. They might also, those intermediaries might also directly finance qualified projects, or those qualified projects will get financed through the community lenders. Next slide. So that's NCIF. CCIA is the other financing program within GGRF. It's $6 billion, and this is the one that focuses on building the capacity of community lenders. And it's also focused on low income and disadvantaged communities. So EPA said that they would make awards to 2 to 7 hub nonprofits, which are again basically these intermediary organizations that will then turn around and fund their networks of community lenders, which are the green banks, CDFIs, and credit unions that Adam described earlier. And so the intermediaries have to award at least 80% of the funds to community lenders for capitalization, and then 90% of the funds have to go to community lenders for capitalization funding and technical assistance subawards. And this is broken down a little bit more in the next slide. 100% of CCIA money has to be for projects located in low-income and disadvantaged communities. And they also 100% also has to go to the projects in those priority project categories of decarbonization, of building and transportation, and distributed power generation and storage. That restriction doesn't apply to NCIF. NCIF is more flexible. It's on the same timeline as NCIF, so we're expecting to hear who will be the CCIA awardees very soon. Next slide. So here's some more information about CCIA and how it will work. It's a little complicated, so I won't go through everything, but again, you can look at the slides as a reference. Capitalization funding is capped at $10 million per subrecipient, which like community lender, unless an exception is granted. Likewise, there's a cap for technical assistance subawards to community lenders that's capped at $1 million, but there's a provision for exceptions as well. And then there's a separate category for TA services and program administration, which can also be provided to community lenders. And the slide kind of lays out like what some examples of those activities are. But basically, you get everything through those intermediaries that will then flow to the community lenders, and then that flows down to the actual projects. Next slide. And then the third program in CCIA or in GGRF is Solar for All, and that's $7 billion. And that one is focused on solar programs, hence the name. 100% of those projects have to be in low-income and disadvantaged communities, or it has to allow them to deploy or benefit from solar. And they're planning to make 60 awards to states, municipalities, territories, tribal governments, and eligible nonprofit lenders. It looks like it will mostly flow through states, but there will be some other programs that will go through some of those other entities. 75% of the funding has to be used for grants, loans, or other forms of financial assistance for deploying the solar, and then the remaining funds can be used for technical assistance or program administration. And then the specific projects that can be created with Solar for All are residential rooftop solar, residential community solar, associated storage, and enabling upgrades. And the timeline is also the same as the other two. So we will be hearing more about who will get awarded in the next few weeks. Next slide. So this slide provides a little more detail about the what the projects under Solar for All can include. I think the one that is kind of most people have the most questions about is like what counts as enabling upgrades. So what we know so far from EPA is that it includes electrical system upgrades and structural building repairs and energy efficiency. Next slide. All right. So where are we now in the process? Next slide. I described a little bit about the timeline so far. So we know that the awardees will be announced soon in March. And then once they're announced, I believe that they may already be in, well, we know that EPA has been talking with the applicants. I guess after they're announced, they have to do some negotiations. So the plan is that in July, the awards will be made. So everything will be finalized. And that's when the period of performance begins. And that just means like the contracts that the awardees will enter in with the government. That's when the contracts start. All of the funds have to be committed from EPA by September 2024. That's from the Inflation Reduction Act, the statute. And then each of the programs have different periods of performance. There's the, in 2029 is when the Solar for All contest ends, 2030 is when CCIA ends, and 2031 is when NCIF ends. And those are all maximums. The request for application and funding opportunity announcements from EPA say that it's up to 7 years, up to 6 years, up to 5 years. So it depends on how those negotiations go with the awardees. So everything we've described so far about these programs is based on publicly available information from EPA. And I know folks who are listening into this webinar probably want to know more questions like when do I need to apply for a loan? What will the terms be? What are the requirements going to be? All of those things we don't know the answers for yet, because all those details will be determined through through those negotiations with the applicants, and we just have to wait to see what comes out. Next slide. So who are those applicants? What we know from public information and from our discussions with folks, we know at least some of the applicants. And so we've listed some of them here for NCIF and CCIA. And so most of these are, at least for NCIF, most of these are kind of new entities that are coalitions of existing entities. And they're often kind of combinations of like nonprofits and community lenders coming together, or networks of community lenders. Yeah, so you can, we have some of the logos for some of the organizations that like make up some of those coalitions listed. So Climate United includes Calvert Impact, CPC and Self-Help. Power Forward includes Enterprise, Habitat for Humanity, LISC, Rewiring America, United Way. We don't have all the members of Justice Climate Fund or CGC or Equality, but feel free to Google them and try to find out more about them. CCIA applicants, again, this is just a smattering. This is not meant to be like comprehensive, but these are some of the organizations that we know have expressed that they're at least interested in applying for these programs. And now I think I'm passing it over to Jamal.
Yes, next slide. So you may be on this webinar thinking, what do you do now? So here are some suggestions of things that we recommend. So Sylvia went over the list of applicants, and I think one potential next step would be to again try to find out who those other applicants are, and also try to find out who from the applicants on the slide, how to contact them. I think it's worth trying to understand what these organizations and entities are doing, and how they're planning to deploy some of the funds. Again, it's not clear who will be awarded, so I think there's a caveat there. But if you are interested, I think it's worth reaching out. Again, so another idea would be to think about your local jurisdiction or your state, and whether those entities have climate plans or not. If they do have a climate plan or some other plan, like infrastructure plan, etc., think about ways that the GGRF and its 3 programs can help support the implementation of some of those projects. For example, does your school district need cooling, heating, or air filtration? That is a qualified project. And so the GGRF is meant to support projects like that. There are also ways that the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and its 3 programs can support the climate pollution reduction grants that are going to states and local governments, as well as the rebate programs. Another example is because of the DOE rebates, there's a rebate program for home electrification and appliance replacement. There are some states that are looking to pair that program with Solar for All so that they are helping to upgrade low-income and disadvantaged community housing to be all electric, and then pairing those buildings and homes with solar to minimize their energy bills. So that's another example of what some states are doing and what you all could be advocating for in your state. So not just about the types of projects, but what are the complementary policies, programs, and regulations that could support more emissions reductions. So net metering, given that GGRF, there's a Solar for All competition, and that is meant to deploy solar. So a net metering policy is one that would be helpful and would help proliferate the deployment of solar in your state. Building performance standards. This is a policy that is meant to improve the quality and efficiency of large multifamily buildings. So if that policy is in place, there will be a lot of multifamily building owners looking for resources and funding and financing to help them meet these standards. So that is another example of an enabling policy. Your organization might also have projects that you want to deploy in your own community. So you might want to deploy a community storage or battery storage project, or a community solar project, or there might be buildings that you want to retrofit yourself, or think about coordinating the retrofit of. These are the types of projects that it would be helpful to get sort of a list and or start to think about what those projects are, to be able to present these projects to your local green bank or your local CDFI or credit union, and start to map out what those projects could look like. And then this was the part that I said in the beginning, but develop relationships with your local community lenders, with other technical assistance providers. So EPA recently announced the Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center, TICTACs. So reach out to those folks, reach out to your state and local governments and agencies, and start to have the conversation around what's the comprehensive set of projects, or it doesn't have to be comprehensive. What is the universe of projects that your local community or your state wants and or needs to meet its climate goals, and start to think about the role that you all can play as advocates or community-based organizations in the deployment of those projects. And that might mean, again, developing relationships with your local lenders, advocating for complementary policies, and or developing your own projects. So these are just examples of what that could look like. And I think I'm kicking it back to Sylvia.
It's me.
Oh, kicking it.
Thanks, Jamal. And I think the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers, the best acronym ever, TICTACs. But so we talked a lot about how you can kind of, like, if you're a community organization or nonprofit, to build relationships with community lenders and state governments who will be deploying a lot of this capital. But it goes both ways. And so for community lenders on the call and really interested in deploying this capital most effectively to generate the biggest impact, now is the time to start engaging with the communities you work in, making connections in the with environmental justice organizations, community-based organizations. Again, think about the priority project categories that you'll need to deploy your capital in. That's in buildings, that's in clean energy, and that's in transportation. So what are those organizations that you can partner with to understand what their needs are, their constraints, their projects are, and how you could potentially structure these dollars to invest in those projects. Think about how you can grow demand for your financing dollars. What does the workforce in your community look like? What does the small business infrastructure in your community look like? Can you make complementary investments to really provide a working capital loan for a small business to do the building decarbonization projects you want to finance? And also, this is an important time to connect with your state and local officials. You know, a lot of folks in the community development space may not interact with their Department of Energy much. Now is the time to do that, start building those relationships to understand what their priorities are and how they're thinking about kind of deploying some of the complementary programs that Jamal mentioned. Kind of similar for government officials. Do you know who your community lenders are and the community-based organizations that are going to be on the ground developing these projects? Have you talked with local philanthropy about kind of the needs that you have in your community? And really how does this is a big tool. It's the biggest non-climate or non-tax climate provision in the IRA. But it's only one tool in the toolbox. How does this tool complement the other programs that you have at your state or local level and the other IRA funds that are going to be flowing down? And then finally, funders, now's the time to really invest and support and build a pipeline of projects. And so, you know, the early stage pre-development investments, the working capital investments, those are really critical to really developing a robust pipeline of projects. So now's the time to do that, to invest in capacity building in your kind of local area, and really figure out where the gaps are. We now have some new tools that are rolling out, the GGRF, the DOE home rebates, but there are still going to be gaps in really making sure that these programs deliver benefits to communities that have been most overlooked in our clean energy transition thus far. And so that's really where you can play a role as well. So I think at this point, I'm passing it back to Sylvia, and I think we're going to be jumping into Q&A pretty soon.
Yeah, go ahead, Taylor.
Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you all for such a comprehensive presentation. That was really great and really helpful. We are now going to be opening it up for questions and answers. So if you haven't yet, please feel free to use the Q&A box to add your question, and we'll be now answering them at this time. So to get us started, this first question is, can you give us an overview of what kinds of projects are eligible and what are the application deadlines and funding decision timelines?
I guess I'll take that. We tried to cover this earlier, but just to reinforce, if you're like a community organization or government entity, we don't know like when the deadlines are going to be yet for you to apply for financing for your project. And we will find out that information in the coming months. So just keep your eyes open to find out from your local community lenders and Green Bank if you have one in your jurisdiction. And then in terms of the types of projects, there's like kind of a complicated list of what's required in terms of how they define qualified projects, but it basically boils down, it's pretty flexible, and it basically boils down to, does the project reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emissions and reduce or avoid other air pollutants? And there are some more restrictions depending on like the specific contest. So like for Solar for All, it's much narrower in terms of like solar, rooftop solar, community solar, enabling upgrades, associated storage. And then CCIA has to be those 3 priority project categories of decarbonized buildings, decarbonized transportation, and I'm blanking on what the third one is right now.
Did you say transportation?
Yes,
Buildings, distributed energy.
distributed energy, of course. Yeah, so it covers a lot of different things.
I just will add and emphasize Sylvia's point about the timelines. I think in essence, though, once these competitions have been awarded, the idea is that any CBO, community-based organization, or state or local government, if you have a project over the next several years, and we talked about the periods of performance, that you would be able to go to a community lender of some type at any point throughout that time and propose your project and be able to get financing. Like that, I think that's the general idea. But I still emphasize Sylvia's point about us not knowing if there will be any timelines associated with like those project applications.
Wonderful. Thank you both for that. And then we had a question around, is there a way for folks now to find out who their community lenders are, or is that something that also is to be determined?
So I can take this one, and so I think, and when we'll send out the slides that'll have kind of more information on the different types of community lenders that these dollars will be flowing through. But really, it's going to be like really do a search online to find, like, to really try to find if your state or locality has a green bank or a community development financial institution or a credit union. Those are like, and go to them to understand if are they aware of this program, and B, if so, what are they thinking? And now is the time to start building that relationship. So there'll be more information in the slides that we send out, but those are the, like, searching for those institutions that serve your locality. Those are going to be your community lenders.
Wonderful. Thank you. And then someone had a question, what's the benefit of getting financing through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund versus more traditional funding options?
I'll start, and then Adam, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the general idea is that this financing should be cheaper. So the cost of capital should be cheaper, loans should have better rates. And so that's part of the idea of being able to crowd in private money by making this public investment part of the capital stack cheaper.
Yeah, nothing to add there. But I mean, it can be tailored. It can be tailored to kind of different needs.
Wonderful. Thank you. And someone asks, can you talk a little bit about what reporting requirements might look like across the programs? I imagine Congress will be interested in how IRA dollars are performing. Are there any thoughts on how that will be evaluated?
I can take that one. So yeah, there is obviously going to be reporting, and EPA has kind of documented the type of reporting that will be required. And in fact, there's a request for information out currently on different reporting metrics to include. But yeah, I mean, there's going to be reporting over that period of performance for each program, and EPA has talked about making that public.
Great, thank you. And then another question, how much of the budget is allocated for community engagement / expertise to understand pace, need, and strategy?
I'm happy to, I'll take a swing at it, and then please, Jamal, Sylvia, jump in. So the short answer is we don't know, because it's really dependent on the application to EPA and what the applicants proposed. But we do know, I think there are a couple categories of eligible expenses that can be used with these dollars. So under the biggest program, which is the NCIF, dollars can be used for market building investments and pre-development. And those seem to be defined more flexibly, where you could really make the case that doing thorough community engagement really supports building the market for the product. So that's under the NCIF. Under the CCIA, there are kind of, this program is really primarily geared toward community lenders and supporting them creating new green products, but there could be some uses there. And then the Solar for All explicitly kind of calls out workforce development and engagement. And that also kind of relates to another question I see here in terms of where the workforce development investments can be made. I think we see that in both the NCIF, in that market building support category, and in the Solar for All program, when it's really tied to solar and storage.
Maybe another way to think about it, and this is to the question about community engagement. These are, whoever the applicants end up being will be implementing various programs. And Adam's point about market building activities is important to note, because as these applicants are deploying their programs, that will be the that will be like the growing availability of capital. But that capital, people need to know about that capital in order to use it. And so another way to think about it is like marketing, outreach, those types of activities. And there's no limit. There's no like regulated limit on what that should look like that the EPA put out. So that's why Adam sort of mentioned that it depends on the applicants. Another thing to flag would be, like, in addition to marketing and outreach of the like financial products and or like technical assistance products, there may be a role in providing by these applicants providing support to your local community lenders, and having those community lenders conduct engagement with communities to understand what their packages should look like too. And so that's another layer that's present here, that it's unclear exactly what that will look like. So there's like marketing and outreach for the product, but then like community engagement to inform the strategy for what your community lender will offer. And that's present here too, that we're unsure about.
Great, thank you. And then another question, is there a site that we can look into in order to determine who applied for each of these 3 tranches of funds? And I will pass this one to Sylvia.
Yes, there is not at this moment. For Solar for All, EPA required the applicants to file a notice of intent, I think is what they called it. So if you Google for Solar for All on the EPA website, you can find that list to see who was planning to apply. So you can see like if your state applied, or if your city, or if there's a nonprofit that applied, that will be covering the territory that you're in. For the other 2, for NCIF and CCIA, we did ask EPA to make that information public, and they declined to do that. But it is possible that they will provide that information after they announce who has who they're selecting as the awardees. So we hope that they do. And yeah, we hope that they will do that when they make their decisions.
And just to add on to that, I think that's a really important point that Sylvia just brought up. Like, if EPA makes these applications publicly available for whoever gets awarded, that's a really good opportunity to understand what the priorities of these organizations are going to be, and go into the conversations with that understanding, and saying like, I agree with this point, but here's where I think you really need to move to meet your goal that you've outlined to EPA. So understanding that if and when they do come out would be important.
Amazing, thank you. And then this question is for you, Adam. For borrowing, would credit score or creditworthiness be used as an indicator or criteria, and how we think about supporting these communities who won't have or fulfill these?
Yeah, great question. And that's, I think, the emphasis on the flexibility that these dollars could play. I mean, it's really going to be up to the awardees, but you know, it is very, very feasible to see a community lender or a state doing alternate underwriting that is not using credit scores, and really trying to prove out the model that if you look at the ability to repay versus somebody's credit score, you can actually have a successful and performing project. And so that's definitely something we would hope to see from some of these awardees.
Wonderful, thank you. Wow, we're almost at the end. That's crazy. Went so quickly. This question's for you, Jamal. How can we use greenhouse gas reduction funding to braid into existing WAP funds and home/HERE's implementation?
Yeah, it's a good question. WAP, I think, is the Weatherization Assistance Program. So here I'll just walk through like an example of what this could look like. So and I'll start with the rebates. And I'll start with the electrification rebates first. So the electrification rebates provide like up to $18,000 for low and moderate income households to upgrade their heating system. And these are not available yet. So I just want to make that known. But $8,000 may not be enough to cover the full cost of a heating system replacement. And so, for example, let's say it costs, I don't know, $10,000. You can get $18,000 in a point of sale rebate, which leaves $2,000 left to cover. So the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund could be a source of capital to cover that $2,000. Again, it would be in the form of financing. And so it would be in the form of a low cost or low interest loan that would allow you to cover that $2,000 that you would then pay back. And with that specific example, the hope is that you are saving on your energy bills and that you have more capital to be able to help you pay that back. So that's one example. With what the weatherization program oftentimes covers the entire cost of qualified improvements. It's a complicated program, but there are times where some things don't get covered because the cost that it takes to retrofit does not exceed the benefits of retrofitting that particular measure. And so some things might get covered while other things don't. And for example, like windows are sort of on the cusp because sometimes it can cost a lot to replace windows. So if you're in the weatherization program and you get your heating system replaced, you get your air sealing and insulation, but are not able to have your windows replaced, then you can seek out low cost financing from like your local community lender to cover the rest of that cost. And so those are just two examples, but there are others that I'd be happy to talk about later.
Amazing. Thank you. That was really helpful. Well, we are approaching the end of our time, so I want to thank everyone for jumping on with us today and extend extreme gratitude to our speakers for sharing their expertise with us as well. As we mentioned, we will be sending out the recording of today's webinar, the slide presentation, and some links that were shared in the chat. So you'll have all of that in your inbox in the coming days. I am also dropping in the chat our post-event survey. If you could fill that out and let us know what you thought of the event, what other questions you might still have, and what other things you'd like to see, that'd be really helpful. And I guess that's it. Thank you all, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.